Okay, so the claim that I'm going to be refuting is that free education has a positive effect on students. The opponent's secondary claims were split into two, with some sub-secondary supporting claims, which is kind of confusing to me. So her first secondary claim was that more students would be able to get a college education with 3 points. Lower income students would get an education, lower dropout rates, and 3 students will acquire the necessary skills to get a career. Her second secondary claim was that free college education will decrease the amount of student debt, with 2 supporting claims. Students won't be affected by the rising costs of higher education in the US, and the second being lower class students will not be forced to rely on student debt. So first of all, some challenges to the claim itself and the way that she supports it with her secondary claims. The claim being made is free education has a positive effect on students, while her secondary claims are all in the future tense. She says more students will be able to get a free college education. Free college education will decrease the amount of student debt. And all the evidence that she does give later on, these are all speculative. They don't show how free education already has a positive effect on students. Some challenges to structure. Actually, that was pretty much it. Some challenges to definition. She doesn't really go over what exactly does free college education entail. Is it just the college tuition itself, or does it include the cost of textbooks, the cost of housing, university fees that we all pay, such as health, student services, parking permits, and so forth? So my response to her first secondary claim is that the speaker fails to give evidence and data on what the potential outcomes would be if free education were to take place. So there's no comparative data. She doesn't give any examples on countries or areas where free education has been implemented and how that has been a positive effect. She only gives examples that are saying that this is what will happen. So for example, in her first secondary claim, she quotes Hillary Clinton by saying that it will guarantee that the children of any family in this country with an annual income of $125,000 a year or less, 83% of our population will be able to go to public college or university tuition free. So, as I just stated, this supports my claim that she doesn't give any comparative data. Going on to reasoning challenges, she argues that free education would lead to lower dropout rates, but does not, again, include an example of an area where this is actually been implemented. Rather, she just provides an example that states that free college education would motivate students. So she states that free tuition is a simple promise that some researchers like Sarah Goldrick Rab at Temple University believe would motivate more working class students to dream of college and actually make it through. This is a bit problematic because she doesn't give comparative data on what exactly would entail if free education college were to take place. So regarding her third point of her first supporting claim, which is students will acquire the necessary skills to get a career, she discusses this quote from Bernie Sanders, which states, we just really need a highly trained and highly skilled electricians, welders, plumbers, mechanics, pipe fitters, and healthcare workers of every kind. The problem with this is that all these occupations that she's using as support for her claim, her supporting claim, they're all occupations that you don't really go to college for, you go to a trade school for, or you go to a vocational school for, or an apprenticeship. So that's a bit problematic there. Some counterclaims that I have for this secondary claim is that free college education is not the only barrier to more enrollment or lower dropout rates. According to Herb O'Haran, the Director of Research and Policy Analysis at the Association of Universities and Colleges of Canada, the demographics and parental education background are also factors that play into the students' motivation and how they feel regarding dropout rates. Another counterclaim that I have is that free college education will endanger the enrollments of private and community colleges. According to Gary A. Olson, president of the Damon College in New York, many students will no longer have an incentive to attend community colleges, as the main reason for community colleges is the low price point. This low enrollment level also backfires, as then state institutions will be overwhelmed with an influx of new students, leading to many other issues such as funding, faculty, and capacity issues at state universities. Free college education will also potentially devalue the bachelor's degree. According to John Eversole, the president of the nonprofit Excelsior College, says that if students don't perceive value in the credentials, then a degree that costs nothing could be valued accordingly. On to the second secondary claim that she poses. Free college education will decrease the amount of student debt. Some evidence challenges. Her first supporting claim is that students will not be affected by the rising costs of higher education in the US. But her evidence to support this claim is just a statistic of the cost of the debt. She doesn't give data on how free education would actually decrease or will lead to students not be affected from this. So her only example is that almost 70% of US colleges, college students borrow to finance their degree, amounting to an average debt of $28,950 for four-year graduates. Some reasoning challenges that she faces in this secondary claim. She reasons that free college education will lead to a decrease in debt. However, student loans aren't exclusively for tuition. She claims through her example of her second supporting point that lower class students will not be forced to rely on student debt. However, the reality of this issue is that colleges also have their own university fees, as I aforementioned in the beginning of my speech. Some counterclaims to this is that low-income students are already given the option of financial aid through FAFSA, scholarships, and Pell Grants. If you go onto the FAFSA website, you can just go to the website and click, am I eligible, and what are the eligibility criteria. So for example, for a family of 5 with an income ceiling of $105,000, they can still get their entire tuition free. For myself example, I'm middle class, so my parents, they make, I think before taxes, we're a family of 5, around $85,000, and I get my entire tuition free. However, like all of you guys, I still have to pay university fees of around $2,000 a year, and I have to take student loans for those. So it's another issue with her claim that free education will lower class students will not be forced to rely on student debt. And that's it.
Well, the fact that there are minor points under each of the secondary claims doesn't necessarily mean that it's overly organized, but I do think the preview is overly organized. You can just deal with those individual points as you get to them. You don't have to have them in your preview. I thought that you did a nice job outlining what the main points are going to be. On your first point where you're challenging the lack of evidence on this, you basically are talking about what the potential is here, and you're suggesting that there's no examples, we have no comparative data, it's all speculative, which I think is a good press to be making on this. I do think that you could probably find some data that talks about this in other places. For example, you suggest that we don't have any comparative data from other countries. Maybe you could find some data that would suggest that this doesn't really achieve the objective here, that, for example, debt is still relatively high, or that students still lack access either because there's too much demand and not enough space for them, or because they are not prepared, for instance, to get into the schools that they are talking about. That's one of the things that I thought was kind of missing from the argument here, that's kind of an obvious counterclaim, and that is that just because people can afford college doesn't mean that they're prepared for college. And we had a speech earlier in the evening about those kinds of things. You know, you could just reference the earlier speech and say, Well, if they had lousy counseling and they didn't know what the hell they were doing and they got into the wrong classes, when they get out of high school, they aren't really prepared for college anyway. So what is advantage is they're giving them free access if they're underprepared. You know, I think there's a potential argument there that's kind of staring you in the face that you could reach up and drop into this position. You know, I think there's some other arguments here that suggest that there are other causes why people don't necessarily succeed in college. You mentioned the status of the family, their occupations, their attitudes about dropout rates, that kind of thing. I think those are okay arguments. I did think that your argument about the skills issue, for instance, that they're going to develop skills, and that Bernie Sanders mentions all these things that are skill-based things that have nothing to do with going to college, that's a very good answer to that particular point. So, you know, we need all those things. Why does free college education address that point? It doesn't. No, that's a pretty straightforward argument there. That seems like it's a non sequitur on the advocate's part. Let's see. And then there are a couple of other claims that you're making here about what free college education might do to the value of a degree, or whether or not it would change the applications of people to go to the schools, or whether they would see it as being worthwhile. I think those are good arguments to make. The evidence on those is a little bit thin, but at least you've made a suggestion there. On the second issue, on the debt point, you do point out that there are other costs that are involved in going to school. I like the personal comparison that you used as a way of illustrating this. And I think, for example, that there's good information that suggests that low-income people are not denied the option of getting to school anyway. So it's not keeping people out. The only question is, what kinds of aid are they getting? Are they only getting loans, or are they getting grants and discounts and those sorts of things? I think you could have a little bit more information on that point too. That point, of course, is maybe 10% of your argument. Most of your argument's on the first point, and so it feels a little bit disproportionate, but it's nicely delivered. It's also 2 minutes overtime, so it's a little long. Yeah, well, we